Well, thank you. I want to thank the ASC for this wonderful opportunity to participate in this very important session. My title today is Ensuring Quality in the Echo Lab, and my goals are to raise awareness that improving quality and value will be essential to the survival of your echo lab, including community hospitals like ours in Pennsylvania. I want to review ways to improve quality in each step of the imaging process. And then I want to endorse the accreditation process as an important way to initiate quality improvement strategies. I have nothing to disclose. We're going through a time of rapid and dramatic change in healthcare, so there's no better time than now to discuss quality and value. There are many ongoing healthcare initiatives, including 3 initiatives that are referred to as the Triple Aim, and they include an improvement in the experience of care. We want to improve quality, patient outcomes, and patient satisfaction. With the rapidly rising cost of healthcare, we're looking to reduce per capita cost. And at the same time, there's something referred to as population health, where we're trying to make our population healthier by increasing access to care and utilizing health care before patients become seriously ill. In medical imaging, we're seeing a dramatic shift from focusing on high volume of procedures to an emphasis on high value of procedures and how they impact patient outcomes. And each lab will be held to a very high standard. So there's going to be opportunities in echo to improve quality and value and provide important clinical information at a very reasonable cost. When we look at the diagnostic process, a patient will present with a symptom or a problem. In addition to the history and physical examination and lab work, medical imaging, including echo, frequently plays a role in that assessment. To guarantee quality in your lab, one approach is to evaluate and work on the multiple steps in this imaging process. And they include patient selection, image acquisition, image interpretation, results communication. And then there's the implementation and clinical decision-making process. We currently don't play a very large role in clinical decision-making, but in the future, labs may be playing a much larger role as we collect information on how echo results can help guide therapy. Assessing and reviewing each domain will increase our opportunities to improve quality and reach our goal of positively impacting patient outcomes. The first step is to utilize echo in the appropriate cardiac patient. It's equally important not to overutilize echo and waste important resources. We want to do the right test in the right patient at the right time. So our lab frequently evaluates the indications for echo and uses the appropriate use criteria to be sure that we're using echo properly in our health system. The ABIM Foundation has actually put a focus on this issue by launching the Choosing Wisely campaign. And the Choosing Wisely campaign has multiple recommendations for cardiology, including one that affects echo. They remind us that we should not perform echocardiography as routine follow-up for mild, asymptomatic native valve disease in adult patients with no change in signs or symptoms. And the ACC guidelines and recommendations back up this recommendation. We know that patients with mild valvular lesions usually have a long period before they develop symptoms. And when mild, there's very little value in ordering routine cardiac testing unless there's been a significant change in the patient's clinical status. So the ACC suggests only repeating echo studies no more than every 3 to 5 years when a valvular problem is mild. When a valvular problem becomes moderate or severe, then you see that the interval of echo increases significantly. But they do not want us to overutilize this test. We want to use the test appropriately in the right patient at the right time. The next step is image acquisition. It's a very important quality improvement parameter that we focus on in our lab. Each lab should really have a state-of-the-art protocol that's well-defined, and we periodically evaluate how our sonographers adhere to this protocol. They should evaluate every structure carefully, and we also review their measurements. We use standardized measurements for each study, and we give our sonographers feedback when we disagree with those measurements. Our lab also has a policy regarding the proper use of contrast to limit our technically inadequate studies, and that's especially true in the ICU setting where contrast agents can actually improve outcomes. We've had a specific emphasis on patient-focused care, so we remind our sonographers that at times we need to expand our imaging to be disease-specific. And certainly aortic stenosis is one of our most common valvular lesions that we are asked to evaluate, and echo is critical in the diagnosis and staging of aortic stenosis. So we frequently review AS cases with our sonographers and review their image acquisition. It's vitally important that they get the measurements correctly, including the LVOT diameter, because errors in this measurement will be squared and lead to significant underestimation or overestimation of the calculated aortic valve area. We also monitor for assessment of the aortic velocities and remind them that we need to assess these velocities in multiple views, multiple angles from the apical window, as well as right parasternal and suprasternal notch, so that we can accurately assess the severity of AS. A new patient population in our lab is the post-TAVR patient. Again, patient-specific imaging is very important because perivalvular aortic regurgitation is a very important finding, but we know that with the acoustic shadowing from the valve, this mandates that our sonographers need to use multiple angles because these jets can be quite localized and not evident on standard view. So the image acquisition at times needs to be patient-centered. So remember, as far as acquisition, we give a lot of feedback, we review cases periodically, and it's an opportunity for education. The next step in the image process is interpretation. And we do quarterly case reviews for each reader in a blinded fashion. We are sure that they assess every single structure and that there's a detailed description of all the important pathology. We look to see if there's agreement in cardiac and valvular function, and we focus on any differences in the grading of valvular function or the grading of the ejection fraction. We discuss these cases when there are significant differences, and we utilize the ASC guidelines to review these cases, and this turns into an excellent teaching opportunity. So we review studies, and we want to also make sure that they're very comprehensive and that they will impact patient care. By comprehensive, we want the echo to answer all the questions that are necessary to make important clinical decisions. This is the guidelines from the ACC regarding indications for surgery on mitral regurgitation, and that's not the point. The point here is that when we interpret these echoes, it's not only important to find whether or not there is mitral regurgitation. We need to be sure that we have a clear assessment of whether this is primary mitral regurgitation or secondary mitral regurgitation. We need an accurate assessment of the severity using quantitative integrated approach to assessing MR, and we're still not done. We need to have an accurate assessment of LV function, LV size, and then pulmonary artery pressure, because all of this information impacts whether we recommend valve surgery, periodic monitoring, heart failure treatment, or CRT management. So again, patient-focused, we want to answer all the questions possible so that we can impact care and decision-making. We need to have good reporting, and this is to remind us that an accurate and timely explanation of the health problem is meaningless unless this information reaches the patient and the healthcare professional so they can act on this information. So communication may be the most important part of this whole process, because without an accurate and timely result, we can't impact patient outcomes and management. So we frequently monitor the time of the study and how quickly it's interpreted and what time it's reported. On all inpatient studies, we report on the same day that the study is done. We also evaluate the quality of the report. We want to avoid any inconsistencies. That is, the measurements should match up with the text. We don't want there to be any ambiguity with our report. We want to localize and quantify all the pathology clearly. And again, I want to stress that it needs to be comprehensive and clear and address the indications for the study. Echo can provide immediate information that impacts these patients, and our lab has a list of critical results that are here on the slide. And these results can certainly lead to life-saving treatments and procedures, and this really requires direct communication with the ordering physician. And each lab should have a policy which includes how we document this communication, and we should have the ability to track adherence to this policy. And this is one situation where not only are we interpreting and giving results, but as we discuss this information, we discuss potential life-saving procedures and interventions with the referring physician. One way to continue your quality improvement in your lab is to utilize the Iac process for echocardiography. This is a great organization, and their mission is to improve healthcare through accreditation. Their online tools really provide the framework for you to work on each aspect of the imaging process, from appropriate use all the way through reporting. And they have you periodically review important quality parameters that will certainly make a difference in your lab. They have certainly made a difference in our lab. And their ultimate goal is to reduce variability, which will result in improved quality. So I strongly endorse the Iac process. Go through the accreditation process and then use the tools for continued quality improvement. So how do we ensure that we have a quality echo lab? Well, we want to be sure that it's patient-centered. We want to address the patient's problems and symptoms and have our greatest impact. The studies need to be appropriate. Remember, right patient, right test at the right time, and use the appropriate use criteria for follow-up. Studies need to be standardized and very complete, and follow up with adherence of our protocols with expansion for specific disease states and disease problems. To reduce variability in our interpretation, we want to use the standardized interpretation guidelines. We want our reports to be accurate, clear, complete, comprehensive, so that we can have the greatest impact. And in the future, I believe that our reporting is going to have additional recommendations regarding clinical management. And this was all going to result in image-guided care and improved patient outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malkowski. Our next speaker is Dr. Burkhard Mackinson. Dr. Mackinson is simultaneously chairing another session and has graciously agreed to come over and speak to us, but will have to leave before the question and answer period. He is from the University of Washington, Seattle, and is on the boards of directors both of Iac Echo and of the American Society of Echocardiography, and is uniquely qualified to speak about quality in perioperative echo.
Thank you very much. It's my distinct pleasure to speak on perioperative echo today. In the past, as many of you know, we had the perioperative track mostly on Saturdays. People would leave, and now we are actually seeing ourselves involved in the rest of the meeting, which I think is a fantastic development, and thanks to the chair of the scientific sessions, Sunil Mankat, who really was supportive of getting that accomplished. I have no disclosure relevant for this talk. Other to say that I am now happily on the board of directors of the ASE and join efforts on the IAC to start perioperative echocardiography standards development so that perioperative echo, similar to adult echo labs and pediatric services, can be accredited. So perioperative services will have an opportunity in the future to go through similar accreditation processes. And this next slide is dedicated to Jonathan Mark, who yesterday received this wonderful award. And it wouldn't be without people like himself who have plowed the way for us to get to a point that we not only look at quality, but also systematic approaches how to assure quality for the future. And certainly Madhav Swaminathan, as the incoming president, has done a lot of footwork along the way. So Elena Nicarara, also on the picture, myself, we are leading these efforts now to carry forward what was started. Now, if we think about quality in general, I think it's important to think for a moment what it actually means. And I think it is how the recipient of a product or a service views the product or service over time. And that means also that the quality differs depending on the circumstances and the perspective of the observer. Quality is whatever the customer perceives it to be. And if we think of technical quality, the question is how good is it? If it's accessibility, it doesn't matter how good it might be if people can't get that quality. So access of care. And then finally, the acceptability, meaning it doesn't matter how good it is if the people don't want it. And so again, those are actually things and topics that we have to deal with as we move forward. Now, from a perioperative physician, quality to the left, that looks pretty difficult to get an access point. You work your way up. And then on the right-hand side, resuscitation not done the way we should. If I think of competence versus excellent as markers of quality, I think of this coffee in competence as relative to an excellent coffee. And I think that's a good kind of picture to keep in mind as we think about what quality in echo should look like. To dwell on that point, yes, this may be a competent image of a left atrium and a little bit of a left-sided aspect, anterolateral aspect of an anterior and posterior prolapse of the mitral valve. But we don't know for sure that that is what we're looking at. If we take a picture like the one on the right, oh, sorry, that didn't work. Let me see if I can make that work. No, it doesn't. But even the still frame, as you appreciate, you see the ligament of Marshall, you see the left atrial appendage, and this actually, if it has played, which it did in the morning, I assure you, quality check, we're done. An anterior and posterior leaflet were actually coming up and really showing the prolapse without any doubt. Now it is playing. I just had to wait. So there you see the anterior posterior leaflet prolapse, bileaflet prolapse. Now I have no doubt what I'm looking at. I have the orientation, aortic valve to the right and the left atrial in the background. Another teacher of mine, Joe Kislow, came up with these rules, and David Adams provided them to me years ago, and I kept them close to my heart, which is, if you don't point at it, you can't see it. If you can't see it, you can't diagnose it. And it's not the heart stupid and talk to each other, which actually is an important aspect of quality. Now, there's a number of other attributes that are listed on this slide, and I don't have time to go into detail, that all in some way describe what quality actually means. But it has to come at a reasonable price and has to be safe, timeless, and complete. So why do we need high-quality TE in the perioperative spectrum? Well, most agree that measuring and improving quality of perioperative TE is important. And hopefully, everyone in your service, at your hospital, in your practice, aims to provide the best service possible. But is that good enough? Are there any quality benchmarks for perioperative TE? Well, there's little data about where quality gaps actually exist. And there's also little data to identify the elements of quality that lead to a better patient care and outcomes. Most is anecdotal or expert opinion, and the quality guidelines for perioperative echo perceived to be lacking. At minimum, what we have and what we really cling on to and hold on to is these guidelines that are the second iteration of the initial 1999 guidelines with Jack Shainwise as a first author. And these are development here with Becky Hahn and others that have taken it to the next level to come up with at least 20 views and beyond that we can agree upon and that we expect for a comprehensive TE. So that's important, to have guidelines as supported by the ASE to move forward. Now for the adult echo lab, there's other appropriateness criteria. There is papers out there as here in Business and Advocacy to achieve quality in cardiovascular imaging, and there's other guidelines and standards that we can look to in order to inform ourselves. And then there's the IAC that is supportive of an accreditation process as it is open for adult echo labs, for pediatric groups, and hopefully in the future for us as perioperative physicians as well. Now, when we think of quality in echo and image acquisition, we think of imaging protocols that need to be developed, recommended images that are referring to the guidelines, and that includes things like quantification for the LV, for the right ventricle. We need to also ensure that anything that's uninterpretable and incomplete is tracked, and that there's a QA process at each institution and practice to minimize those uninterpretable studies. We think of the TE report, which often is lacking for the perioperative realm. I have to admit, if you go out into the country, there may be services that don't even report, that leave the data on the echo machine and it doesn't go even to a server. We have to have a date and time, the demographics, the medical record number, the indication for the TE. Requesting physicians need to be contacted afterwards and need to be protocoled. The key findings need to obviously be documented, then an overall impression and conclusion, the question of complications, and then the date and time the report was signed. So all that needs to be in place. That's a minimum requirement. Luckily, Joseph Matthew, who actually was my former division chief at Duke, came up with a group of individuals on the Perioperative Council with these recommendations that are often overlooked, unfortunately. This is a paper from 2006, but if you go into the details of that paper, you learn that they have done an enormous effort in order to come with recommendations back in 2004 and 2005, finally published in 2006. For instance, what is the minimum requirement in order to get to a point of certification? And that number has arrived for the advanced perioperative echo physician to at least a number of 300. And then the number of personally performed echoes, it is 150. And then for maintenance of competence, and when we think about standards and the standards that we develop for the IAC, we think of a number somewhere between 25 and 50 examinations per year that everyone who wants to be part of a perioperative service that gets accredited should be doing on a regular basis. Now, there's other aspects in that paper that I just briefly wanted to highlight, which is the CQI in the perioperative echo as an ongoing process that characterized by three assumptions about quality. One is you have to have the technical advancements in echo, and they may have to redefine how we think about quality and think about that 3D versus 2D and how we incorporate 3D and strain analysis and so forth into our assessment and reporting. Certainly, the assessment of quality requires comparisons that could be, in our field, the perioperative site, the surgical finding, or another imaging modality. And then finally, quality is enhanced by repetitive practice. There are other aspects of periodic review that are essential, the documentation of the indications of why the procedure was actually done, why the echo was actually required. The appropriate use of US technology and controls is a key aspect. Finally, the adequacy and presentation of the image plane, along with the concurrence between the recorded images and a timely written report. Finally, a recommendation of a minimum of 5 cases a year that in each service should be subject to review every 12 months. That is a minimum requirement. And again, we are trying to find a low threshold and then look over time how perioperative services are able to engage. As part of what else is needed, well, we certainly have to have some demonstration of quality. And that's tricky, and I don't have time to go into details. Essentially, the demonstration that quality does not cost more, or that the extra cost of the quality will actually result in improved outcomes. Finally, a few examples in the literature of what has been done in the past. Here's, for instance, a study by Miller and colleagues that looked at the adequacy of a basic intraoperative echo, and they incorporated the comprehensive standard exam in their work. And what they used is the 1999 standards that were published as guidelines with the ASE. And they compared with their own historical controls, which was 42% of recording rate, that all experts showed a significant improvement in their ability to record not only the images for a basic exam, but then also in a much higher rate of reporting. And here's the bar graph where they look at in black, the historic comparison, and then the introduction of a comprehensive exam. Here's another example, which is the question of the adequacy of images in intraoperative echo, a quality improvement project, where actually in this interesting study, people in New Zealand did not find that the introduction of a standard examination necessarily actually improved their already maybe relatively high mean acquisition ratio of 0.62. Again, they didn't look at the reporting, they just looked at the mechanism of reporting to introduce a higher rate of actually image acquisition. So that was a little bit interesting to see that what they did change was the reporting that they looked for, but then they actually, as an endpoint, looked at the adequacy of imaging. Maybe that's why they didn't find a significant impact. More importantly and more recent, here's an excellent paper that Dr. Thaden and Patricia Pelika were authoring, where they were able to show that through the accreditation process for an adult echo lab, at least in patients with valvular heart disease, the echocardiography reports from accredited labs were more likely to be complete. They also found that accredited laboratories were more likely to follow a guideline-based approach and recommendations to quantify not only aortic stenosis, but also to provide, in general, a higher level of quality in color and spectral Doppler acquisitions. I want to come close towards the end with a few statements that I found important as we think about this, which is walking the walk, where achieving quality is harder than it seems. Here's Pam Douglas. We have learned to talk about quality, but can we in echo also walk the walk? And then an excellent editorial that Catherine Otto at my institution has written and shared with me before publication for input, which is an echocardiography as a transition from the master of the craft to the admiral of fleet. And what she is referring to is to set, amongst other points, to set standards for the appropriate scope of practice, regardless of who uses ultrasound and who uses what technology, be it point of care versus TE versus adult transthoracic echo. And this is a table, again, that I don't have time to go into detail, but just wanted to highlight the editorial and the depth of and wealth of information in that editorial by Catherine, which shows that there is a number of areas, such as cardiac surgery and interventional procedures, where a number of professionals contribute to the imaging. And if you look further down, there's opportunity for quality improvement. There's also sections where she discusses how these images are being interpreted and what happens to the report. And I think a big range is possible here that we see in our practices. Again, it incorporates anything to the right, such as point-of-care echocardiography. So I recommend you to look into that. To sum up, what are we looking at for next steps? We look at the development of Iac Standards. And as you see, there's two sponsoring societies. On the one hand, the Society of Cardiovascular Anesthesiology. On the other hand, the American Society of Echocardiography, to support this approach to set a key standard that is inclusive and achievable to start. So not to cause anxiety of folks, not to be inclusive, but rather be inclusive than exclusive, especially as we start this process. We also want to start offering accreditation for perioperative services in the near future. May not happen quite this year, but we hope to get there sometime early next year. And we have to understand that a safe and more efficacious use of perioperative TE relies on active quality assurance in our programs and practices. And here I have kind of summed it up in a picture or figure that will appear in COPE Blue Pages submissions to JACE, hopefully come up in August of this year. So if you want to take a look at this, we summarized our efforts as a first rollout of what is going to be involved and what's going to happen as next steps. And with that, I would like to summarize that quality assurance programs have to support anyone who performs perioperative echo similar to other means of echo to improve not only their own diagnostic skills but also their overall practice and patient care. And then the standards of accreditation for perioperative echo will need to be adapted to account for the wide range of practices and providers and the rapid change in perioperative care and the application of perioperative echo. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mackinson. Our third presentation this morning will be the appropriate use by Dr. Jeff Rose from Sanger Clinic in Charlotte, North Carolina. Jeff.
Well, our technical quality on AV is working, so that's terrific. Well, good morning. Just a quick editorial comment. I think this is the third year that we've tried to organize content like this into a value summit in the morning. We have a session that will follow this as well. And, you know, when we first started doing this, I think we had about 6 people in the room. And it's just wonderful to see so many people, you know, here and engaged in, you know, in this important work. So I'm going to talk about the appropriate use of appropriate use this morning, no disclosures. And we've just heard 2 great talks kind of setting the stage for my talk about quality and appropriate use. If we just, for your, baseline setting, if we just have a common definition, we just heard this from Burkhard about what quality is. But I think if we really want to distill it succinctly, the degree to which healthcare systems, services, and supplies for individuals, for populations, increases the likelihood for desired health outcomes. I think that's what we're all striving to do on a daily basis. The question is, how do we actually deliver on that? And you just heard in the first talk this so-called information chain or imaging chain about each step along the way and how we have to be purposeful at each point. What we're going to talk about now in terms of appropriate use criteria is really what gets the ball rolling, right? Because we can be perfect at steps 2 through 5 or 2 through 10, but the first issue is, did we need to do the study in the first place? And as we're getting into the value world, the most expensive study is the study that wasn't needed, right? So we've really got to put some energy into how to figure this out, and it's a thorny issue, as we'll get into in just a minute. So how did we get here? Where did this come from? And if we just go back about a decade or 2 and we look at where healthcare was at the turn of the century, we saw, and these are data per beneficiary, we saw that things were relatively flat with respect to invasive procedures and E&M and that. But as many in the room will remember, there was really this acceleration of non-invasive imaging. And that got a lot of attention within the cardiovascular and, in fact, the general medical community. And in response to that, some analysis, why was this happening? There were a variety of issues on the provider side, sort of that culture of completeness. We had these great tools. We should apply them uniformly. There was that sense that less care was not as good care, both on the provider side and the patient side. The phenomenon was the increase in volume that, that we just discussed. And how did that play out? This is a classic slide from Bob Hendel. And this is about nuclear cardiology, but we could put similar data up for echocardiography or other non-invasive imaging. And I just have circles around. This is the incidence of nuclear imaging among Medicare beneficiaries in the Pacific Northwest. It's about a third of what it is in the southeastern U.S. Okay, so same disease states, right? Threefold use. Now, is that practice variation? Is that, why is that? But there's obviously clear economic consequences of this. In similar fashion, we have data from echocardiography about the same phenomenon happening. So this was the state of affairs in terms of the application of the tools that we have. So this led to the genesis of the first AUC, which were produced in 2007. Pam Douglas, Ray Steinbach, Bijoy, Neil Weissman, and many others kind of pulling this together and for the first time saying of the things that could be done, where ought we think about doing them and where might we not start to do them, and can we codify that in some kind of way? And I think we're all familiar with these kinds of classifications. If we could pull together certain very discrete clinical situations, we could probably describe them on a scale of things that you probably really shouldn't do, things you should always do, things that are kind of in the middle. Some of this informed by the peer review literature, some of this informed by just expert opinion. And the stronger, the higher the number, if it's a 9, that probably came from something where there were multiple peer-reviewed studies that we ought to do this, something in the 1 or 2 category, similar things that we ought not to do. So the array of things in common clinical circumstances we could put into this kind of classification. So how did it work out? Well, if you actually look at when we started talking about this as a community in 2005 to 2009, that rate of acceleration began to slow. And actually, Alan Perlman and Mike Picard wrote a classic paper in 2011, 2012, really looking back at Medicare data, and actually showed an inflection in the growth curve. The Choosing Wisely campaign was launched in 2012. The important part is we talk about appropriate use criteria fairly commonly today, but these things didn't exist a decade ago. So I think it's really been a transformation within our community to bring this type of thought process to this. And in fact, in 2013, we saw the lowest growth in healthcare spending in 50 years. So people thought, we have solved this, we are, sort of on the right path. In looking at this, and the AUC were updated in 2011, one of the observations were that the rarely used studies, in the beginning, as you'll recall, we used to call this inappropriate use. We've changed that to rarely appropriate use for a variety of reasons. But what we found as we sort of tweaked the criteria and so forth, the common theme was, I think, what we all experience as practitioners is that the studies coming in from the outside seem to be the ones that are where we have the most challenges in terms of their appropriateness. So how have things unfolded? Well, over 2013 to 2017, we're right back to where we were in terms of total healthcare spending. We're now at about 18% of GDP. Just to frame this, our common code, the 93306, we're going to do about 2.4 million of these studies in 2017. We have data from 2016 going forward. Sorry, these slides are advancing on their own. Volume's going up by 3%, and we're going to spend basically $588 million on that one code. It's interesting because the Medicare budget is $588 billion, so 1 out of every $1,000 is spent on this code. So just to kind of frame it in terms of what we're doing with respect to healthcare spending. So AUCs were really put in place to provide some framework for clinicians to inform judgment, not to say always do this, never do that, but to begin to give a frame of reference about how we might start to think about things. And then to implement this, we embarked on a societal level, but also local levels as well, about educational campaigns. How can we educate providers? What kind of decision support tools can we put into our emerging, evolving EMR systems? How can we make this easier and user-friendly? And then how do we provide feedback? So there have been a variety of efforts along the way to try to do this, from educational sessions in labs and in communities to handing out cards for people to put in their pockets, to smartphone applications, to a variety of things. And just to see how those efforts can work out, this is work from Sasha Badia when he was at Mass General. And just to walk through this slide for a moment, this was done in house staff and really, controlled population. How can we educate this team of new providers about what we ought to do and what we might not need to do? And so a randomized trial, a control group, and the group that had the education. Sorry about that. Don't know why our slides are moving on their own. But in any event, what we found was, or what their team found, is those that were educated had a 13% rate of rarely appropriate studies, where those who just were sort of passively doing what have you, somewhere around 34%. And similarly, if you looked at it from the other side, there was a greater use of appropriate studies than those who had received the education. So that was a first start, and that led to what I think in our field is at this point the seminal study around this area, again by Dr. Badia, Mike Picard, Rory Weiner. This is a prospective, multi-center, investigator-blinded, randomized controlled trial about education with respect to AUC. And just to kind of give you some information on this trial, so practitioners in the community were given education in terms of, electronic media and so forth, but also feedback based on the ordering patterns that they had. And there was a control group that just sort of got whatever, standard practice. What you'll see from this graph on the blue, those who got the intervention, there was a 22% decrease in the rarely appropriate studies that these practitioners were ordering relative to the control group. So, and this is an example of the kind of scorecards and feedback that these practitioners were receiving. So on a monthly basis, electronically, providers would get feedback that said, this is what you did in the last month, and this is what was appropriate and inappropriate. What we see here, routine surveillance for prosthetic heart valves, routine surveillance for EF when there's no clinical change. These were the common reasons why people were ordering rarely appropriate studies, so feedback could be delivered back to this group. So able to make a difference with respect to reducing the ordering of tests that we would agree are not necessary. As I said at the outset, this is a really thorny issue because continuing along this path and continuing to educate people and to get it ingrained as routine behavior is really, really tough. This trial took a lot of effort, took those going through records and making the call, was this an appropriate test or not an appropriate test, then generating scorecards, then generating feedback. It's wonderful to see it in a study. How do we make this happen in the real world in everyday practice? That's really the challenge that's in front of us. How do we extend this into the full array of providers out there who are ordering echocardiographic studies? We have nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, hospitalists, not only that, community providers. How do we get that education out there? This is an issue that we still don't have an answer to. How do we capitalize upon big data? How do we use natural language processing and so forth so that we can, through the EMR and so forth, understand and electronically screen as to whether a study ought to be done or might not be done? These are the big questions that we have to face. So just winding up here, just a couple of points. So AUC were developed to combat overutilization. We think that there's been an impact, but the sustained effectiveness is still uncertain. It has been helpful in evaluating patterns of use, so we can use this as a tool to see how are we performing in this region of the country versus that region of the country. It gives us a framework for assessing patterns of care. Educational tools have been sort of promoted and promulgated, but where do we need to go from here? Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, it has to become more electronic. It has to become more automatic. It has to be less sort of human dependent. We also have to look at the other phenomenon, and that's underuse, right? All of this has been about overuse, too many tests. What about the people who aren't getting the tests that they actually need? Who's looking at that, and how do we do that? That's why we need an electronic system, because it's easy to go through and say, well, you ordered this test, you didn't need it. It's much harder to say you didn't order the test that ought to have been done, particularly in an underserved community. What about cost effectiveness? There's a variety of ways we can look at clinical problem X. Should we be looking at it by echo or MR or CT? Where does cost come into this decision? Where does clinical effectiveness come into play? And then, of course, we've got to look at outcomes at the end of the day. And just, winding up, this is kind of the issue, right? This is repeat evaluation for heart failure. We can do echo, we can do nuclear, we can do SPECT, PET, CMR. Which one should we do, right? Becomes an issue as we're trying to figure out clinical practice. So here's a way to think about it. Put AUC in the middle. Where do the AUC come from? Well, they come from guidelines, and guidelines are global. It comes from the literature. And all of us at our institutions kind of take these AUCs and we sort of form pathways, whether they're formalized or informal, depending upon the expertise that we have. CMR might be the right test, but if you don't have access to cardiac MRI, well, you're probably not going to order it, right? So we have to create pathways locally that use our expertise and our assets. The guidelines come from the evidence base, and that's a small box, because if you think about the actual number of things that we do that have a very rigorous evidence base and the number of things we do on a daily basis, it's actually rather small, right? This is really what it looks like. What happens is when we're doing appropriate care and creating pathways, we need to be feeding this into registries, and Sharif is going to talk about this in the next session. We need to be gathering these data. We need to be learning. We're all familiar with evidence-based practice. We needed to be better at practice-based evidence, right? We need to track the things that we're doing and learn from it, right? That's how we know that ACE inhibitors don't work as well in African-American populations, right? We have to do real-world stuff and learn from it. From that, we can do the meta-analysis, we can do the clinical trials, which cost a lot of money, to get the rigorous evidence base. But to turn a blind eye to the practice-based evidence is really missing an opportunity. And then for those of you who are very interested in transforming care, if you go to the Catalyst website at Harvard under Pathfinder, there's a great graphic here that really talks about transformation. We think about transformation from the basic science lab to the bedside and so forth, but there's the other part of transformation that we're all interested in. Well, that's practice transformation. That's improving the care of patients. That's improving the care of populations. That's harder work to do, but this is the work that we need to do in the value environment. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next to the podium is Dr. Kirk Spencer from the University of Chicago Medical Center, whose topic is Imaging and Information Technology Management of the Echo Lab.
Well, great. So let's move on to the next stage in our Echo Labs of quality. So we're going to talk about the imaging and information technology and how quality plays a role here. I have no disclosures. So I'm going to take you through the next steps. So it's image acquisition, storage, review, reporting, and databasing and analytics. Well, I think we all know in our labs that a quality echo lab starts with image acquisition, starts with quality sonographers. And so we really need to be supporting credentialing of our sonographers, the continuing educational efforts of our sonographers, and getting our sonographers access to and education for the adoption of new technologies. Well, image acquisition quality also starts with quality equipment. As you know, this is the minimum requirements for a machine that should be performing echocardiography, having 2D, M-mode, color, and spectral Doppler tissue imaging, should have EKG gating, harmonic imaging, the ability to perform contrast-enhanced exams, and have access to a variety of transducers. Image acquisition quality also is a comprehensive assessment. This is from the ASC document on quality echo lab, so you should all be very familiar with this document. This is the minimum here. That document was meant to set the floor. It wasn't meant to set the ceiling of what is the best that we can do, what is the greatest we can do in a lab. That document was meant to set the floor. This is the minimum that we should be doing for quality in our echo labs. And these are all the minimum things that should be acquired in an adult transthoracic echocardiographic examination. Well, when we talk about image acquisition, I think as echocardiographers and quality, we need not only think about what we're doing, but what others are doing too. Focused cardiac ultrasound, point of care ultrasound, incredibly important procedures, incredibly valuable techniques. Focused cardiac ultrasound, what is it? It's an examination of the cardiovascular system as an adjunct to the physical examination to allow rapid detection of a limited number of evidence-based findings at the bedside. Let's remember that these point of care and focused cardiac could be done by a physician with as little as 4 hours of training, perhaps done 20 studies, might be done on a tablet or a pocket device with 2D imaging, and a limited number of images may be acquired. Sometimes from a single view is all you need in a focused cardiac ultrasound examination. You may only take 2 or 3 loops. No criticism of that. That's perfectly fine to answer the question that's at hand at the bedside. Really important. But I think as cardiologists and sonographers involved in quality, we have a responsibility to maintain the quality in the practice of echocardiography while enabling these other procedures to occur. In no way we want to stand in the way of those. They're incredibly important, useful procedures. We want to enable ultrasound to be used by non-echocardiographers to augment their clinical assessments traditionally based on physical examination alone. And in that point, so from a quality image acquisition point of view, I think it's very important that we still see limited transthoracic and point of care ultrasound as different procedures. So remember that the limited transthoracic is not meant to refer to the limited abilities of the person performing or interpreting the examination. It really is meant to refer to the limited number of images required, and that a limited transthoracic requires the identical quality, the same knowledge base, same training acquisition, same interpretation competence as comprehensive echocardiography. All right, so what about image storage quality? Pretty straightforward. Each machine should have digital image storage method that should be compatible with the DICOM standards. The images should be stored and maintained for a time period mandated, usually by the laws in your state, and that may vary. Image review quality, we want to use a digital review station. We want to have the minimum requirements to be able to adjust the contrast, the brightness, the loop speed, obviously. We want to have the ability to compare images side by side. Obviously, we want to have the ability to quantify. We want to have the ability to do advanced analysis, and we want to have remote access to our images. There are some things coming for image review that may also change the way that we look at image or change the quality way that we look at images. There are some people who now think one of the ways that we can use our information technology to display the images is rather than to display them in the way that they were acquired. And we know that if we're thinking about the mitral valve, we're going to look at image 1 and then image 8 and then image 12 and then image 40 and assimilate all those at the end of the study. Some people are proposing that we look at it by the structure. So if you're interested in the mitral valve, show all the mitral valve pictures together. So that may be a way that we might be reviewing and changing how we review images by structure rather than just by the order that they were acquired. Certainly, artificial intelligence is going to have a big impact on our quality and our reading, whether it's going to be doing it for us or whether it's just going to be checking us. I think both are perfectly good strategies. These are from an artificial intelligence pre-read of a study, automatically measuring the left ventricular end diastolic dimension, the LVOT, and the left atrial volume. These are all done without any human touching the study, and I think, granted, it's a beautiful looking study, but it did a pretty good job of getting all 3 of those measurements correct. I think from a quality point of view, comparison to prior studies is something that, let's face it, when we all get busy, is something one of the first things to go, how carefully we compare to the prior study. As you know, we typically do it now. We check for the prior report. We look for differences. We select the loops in the prior study. We select the loops in the current study. We look at the differences between those, and then we insert a comparison statement. And again, why not use our information technology to make us better at this process and more likely to do it? It's actually very easy to have a computer compare the differences between 2 reports, have it go find the relevant images in the current study, find the relevant images in the prior study, and then bring those up automatically and say, hey, it looks like there's a difference in MR, it looks like there's a difference in the LV function in these studies. would you like me to display the relevant images for those? And then display them, and then potentially even offer comparison statements to automatically insert into the study. Hey, it looks like the mitral regurgitation has changed. We don't want to just do it by having a computer compare the two reports, right? We want to present those images to a physician, to a human being, and say, do you agree that the MR is different? And if it is, why not just accept it and move on? Quality reporting, very important. You've heard a lot about that already. This is, something I think in our labs we need to, we need to be the people in our hospitals that won't allow this to happen. Here's an admission from a patient admitted from the emergency room, and we find here written underneath the physical examination, bedside echo, heart okay. I have no idea what that means, okay? So I think we as echocardiographers, we really need to draw the line on using the word echo, in my opinion, okay? I think using the word echo for ultrasound of the heart is confusing to the patients, to the providers, to the referring physicians, and so I think that needs to say bedside ultrasound, focused cardiac ultrasound, point of care ultrasound, something like that. So using the word echo implies that an echocardiogram was performed. Obviously the reporting of that is grossly inappropriate. For reporting quality in the echo lab, these are again from the ASC's quality document, the recommended findings, recommended measurements, and recommended things that we should comment on in every comprehensive echo report. In reporting, most labs use a facilitated reporting. Again, uses a drop-down menu of codes to generate a written report. Most of you are familiar with that. I think facilitated reporting leads to quality also. It gives you consistency among readers. It gives you improved organization, gives you more readable reports. It avoids the errors inherent and the slowness inherent in dictation. But one of the things that I've become very convinced of is that if we have structured reporting and facilitated reporting, why not let the computer help us make better reports? We can potentially, if the computer can see all these finding codes, we can look for errors, look for inconsistencies, look for omissions. We can compare the document and say, does it go against any of the ASC guidelines? We can also look for ICAL compliance. We do all these things on the back end. We make our reports, and then every 3 months we say, oh my gosh, we haven't done our QA in 3 months, and we print out a bunch of the reports, and we look at them, and we say, oh yeah, we missed that one, we missed that one, we missed that one. Let's do it in real time, okay? And if you have structured reporting, it's actually quite easy. Here's some examples of how this works. Here's a report that comes out, and you all sitting there, well, that doesn't happen in our lab. I promise you this happens in your labs, okay? So here's one that just accidentally no TR and mild to moderate TR snuck into the same report, right? That is poor quality. Everyone here would agree that that is a poor quality report. Maybe a great lab, a great sonographer, a great reader. They made a mistake, and that snuck out, and that just says to the referring physician that isn't a quality report, okay? Very easy to have a computer detect both of those and say, hey guys, you said both of those, one of those can't be right. Here is a more subtle one. We said the doctor said mild to moderate, or it said moderate severe mitral regurgitation, but it said normal left atrial volume. Now, well, technically that can be true. That sounds weird, right? There's something funny there. So why not alert the reader to that and just say, hey, this is possible but unlikely, and give them the opportunity to say, no, I'm going to stick with that, the left atrium is normal, and accept it, or say, oh my gosh, thanks, you caught that for me. That left atrium isn't normal. It's actually wrong, okay? So why not have a computer improve our quality? Here's a report that appears to have a measurement inconsistency. So the LV systolic function is normal. We come down here, the fractional shortening at 15%. Those come out in all of our reports. We see that sometimes, right? But somebody made the measurement, we didn't see it, it snuck into the report, and it just looks bad. So why not have a computer identify for that and allow us to correct that? This is something that implies another finding is present. So it said there's an LV thrombus. Well, we know that if there's an LV thrombus, we should probably have read LV dysfunction, an apical wall motion abnormality, or something. LV thrombuses are funny to just appear if the rest of the study is normal. So again, if we don't see those things, have a computer say, hey, LV thrombus is usually associated with one of these things. Do you want to go back and think about adding one of those things? Okay, it helps improve the quality of the report. This helps improve the ICAL consistency. It's an ICAL criteria to comment on all structures of the heart, even if they're not seen. So in other words, we shouldn't just say, well, I didn't see it, I'm not going to comment. No, you have to say, the left atrium was not well visualized, okay? And so that's, again, a trivial thing for the computer to say, did you comment on everything? So here we see there's no comment on the left atrium. And so, again, why not have our computer alert us and say, hey, you didn't say anything about the left atrium, would you like me to put any of these codes in for you? And then we don't have to catch that ICAL mistake on the back end, we can catch it before we sign the report. Who doesn't want to sign only ICAL compliant reports, okay? So why not have the computer make sure that those are the case? Here, as we know from the AAC and the ICAL, there are demographics that are required on every report. Again, very easy to check, and if something's missing, his report with the BSA is missing, just alert us that the BSA was missing from this report. Why generate a non-compliant report when we can catch it on the front end? We can take all the AAC guidelines, so you can have your reports look, are they consistent with AAC guidelines? So here's something that says LV performance is moderately reduced, but it reports the ejection fraction of 28.6. So again, you can even put a reminder into the physician. This is a reminder that the ASC 2015 document on chamber quantification states that an LVEF below 30 should be quantified as severely reduced. Okay, so why put out this, sign this report that goes against what your society is saying should be said? So let's get to the point about whether this happens. Yes, this happens. So there are actually, if you make enough of them, there are about 4,000 things you can look for in a report, both errors, inconsistencies, and omissions. When we looked at it in over a 15-month period in our lab, we actually had 2.4 alerts per report. 83% of our reports had at least one conflict. These aren't all major errors. Some of them are really subtle, minor things that we ignored. 54% of the time, the physician changed the report. There very clearly is as you look at the number of conflicts and reading speed, no surprise, right? The line goes up. The faster you read, the more likely you are to make those errors. And so we are making these, they're not all major errors, but we are making inconsistencies. We are omitting things in our reports that we shouldn't be doing. This is something from one of our physicians who was using the rules at our place and went somewhere else and sent me this email. As much as it pains me to say this, I think I'm going to miss the Spencer rules. They're not my rules, but anyway. Just looked at a finalized echo report at her new facility for a patient I'm seeing in clinic. There's a page and a half of measurements. About a third of the measurements have an asterisk indicating the value's out of normal range, but it's basically a normal transthoracic, okay? So all those measurements just got into the report. No one sort of cross-checked them, and it would have been very simple for a computer to check those. Lastly, IT, databasing, and analytics. So obviously structured reporting is great for finding cases. I don't know if this is the same way that you keep track of interesting echoes in your lab. This is how we do it in our lab, right? We have a book that we write down the interesting cases, right? Once you have structured reporting, it's very easy. We don't have to say, oh my gosh, what's the name of the guy that had the big thing in his right atrium and he had the TR, right? You can search big thing in right atrium and TR, and you can find the patient very quickly, rather than going through this book of abnormal echoes. Databasing analytics obviously makes you do research. Having a robust database lets you do QA much easier. You can look for all your positive stress echoes. You can look for all the AS cases that were done by sonographer S with a simple query. You can do things like your turnaround time for your inpatients. You know, what percentage of your studies are turned around in what period of time. And you can certainly look at your productivity by sonographer, by day of the week, by type of study. Those all things become very easy to do when you have robust analytics and robust database. Again, use your IT to help you do quality. Why not have the computer help you generate better reports, help you do better QA on the back end? We ought to take advantage of all those things. So in summary, IT can help improve quality in the echo lab, both the quality image acquisition and storage, review of the digital images. Artificial intelligence may help us with view identification, measurement, and pre-reading. We certainly can use IT to reduce the errors, inconsistencies, and omissions in our reports. And again, a robust IT databasing solution that facilitates doing QA and QI on the back end. Thank you.
Our fifth speaker this morning on the Practical Guide to Peer Review is Dr. Richard Grimm from Cleveland Clinic.
Don't you think it's on auto advance? I mean, that's what's yours.
Thank you, Rich.
Thanks. Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. Feel, though, as maybe I've, in a sense, maybe drawn the short straw here today, having to talk on peer review. I mean, anytime you talk about peer review, everybody gets kind of anxious and concerned because we're put on the hot seat, essentially, right? We all believe that we're outstanding echocardiographers, sonographers, and that we always do things well and we're doing things for the patients. But the reality is that we need to, in fact, monitor that, to demonstrate that, and it's a critical part of our lives, especially today. So I've been asked to speak relative to a practical guide to peer review, and so I have no disclosures, first of all, but I'll talk about a little bit as to why it's needed, what's needed, the structure and format of a peer review program, the implementation, and then ultimately the impact. Well, it's needed in fact, in part because if you're going to become an accredited lab, peer review needs to be part of that. Unfortunately, the guidelines for peer review are relatively scant in terms of how it should be done optimally. And in fact, I think in most cases we can do better. The society has standards. ICAL has their standards. We have internal standards, of course, in our organizations relative to the institution, our departments, and for employees as well. So for all of those reasons, and most importantly for patient care, for optimal patient care, and to demonstrate that we in fact do a great job in our individual echocardiography laboratories, peer review should be a part of that. So what are the necessary components? Well, I would propose that certainly a good and extensive lab infrastructure relative to the cardiovascular PACS system, the informatics, and the equipment is a critical component. We need a structured reporting tool. Again, not that it's absolutely necessary in order to conduct peer review, but it'll make your lives a whole lot easier. And a lot of what Kirk just referred to, I think, demonstrates how that can be so important and critical, especially in a peer review process as well. We need sonographer image acquisition protocols. We need physician interpretation and reporting guidelines. We need a feedback and process improvement process. And critically, we need transparency and impartiality in any peer review process that we're planning on putting together in our laboratories. In our institution, as we extend this to the entire health system, we've recognized and we've been legally advised to develop a peer review committee and charter, and in fact seek medical executive committee approval at each of the surrounding hospitals that are inside our system. So getting started. Well, again, first of all, you want to be able to provide an environment for success. And by this I mean providing tools such in the structured report, excuse me, such as Kirk referred to a minute ago, consistency checking tools, for example, making sure that all of the main components, the more seemingly menial parts of the report, the patient's correct spelling of their name, their demographics, the blood pressure, the heart rate, all of these things that we expect to be in a report are in the report. And to enable that to be checked, reviewed, and processed by the reporting system. In order to do that, of course, a structured reporting system and process is needed. These decision support tools can go even further with regard to consistency checking, as Kurt referred to, making sure that you're not sending out a report that reports some degree of MR in one statement and no MR in another statement. And that we establish expectations and standards for that reporting. So this is an example of our reporting system. This is a report in which we have a consistency checker, and we've written rules into our reporting system, and you can see a report on the left side and a worksheet on the right side, and here's a little button, a little orange label tab that pops up orange and demonstrating to us that there is something within our report that is not consistent, that needs either a mandatory field filled in, or that there's an inconsistency in the report. And so we actually run these rules. The sonographer will run them initially when they're completing out their portion of the report, and then the physician will complete and check and run these rules upon verification. So this again, improves quality and compliance, not only with our accreditation guidelines and laboratory policies, but consistency and accuracy in diagnostic reporting. So here's an example of some of the rules that we've written into our structured reporting system relative to TE results, stress results, billing issues, discrepancies between observations and measurements, LV systolic function in EF, LV size and then diastolic volume index, pulmonary hypertension and RVSP, LA size and LA volume index, MR severity, and so on. And then, again, relatively basic, simple items that we need and mandate that are going to be part of every single report. So these are the rules that are automated. And again, when you're implementing a peer review process, you don't want the physician who's being peer reviewed to have to be so concerned and overly concerned that many of those mandatory fields are not already in the report and maintained. And then, as I mentioned, making your colleagues aware of the expectations and the standards for reporting. When we first began our peer review process, our formal peer review process in Cleveland nearly 5 years ago, I first of all came up with a summary, and this is just a small list, relatively small list of expectations for reporting, and such things as making sure and mandating that prior comparisons are performed in every single case. Because we have a system-wide cardiovascular PACS system that is enterprise-wide, we're able to very readily pull up all other images on the patients on prior exams, and so it's actually a relatively quick and straightforward process to compare side by side. We expected all physicians to report regional wall motion abnormalities in all cases. We expect that a statement on valve regurgitation and stenosis severity is present, as opposed to just stating that aortic stenosis is present. So again, some fairly basic issues, but again, we made sure that we stated up front what was expected of these physicians for reporting and the sonographers before we implemented the peer review process. And in point of fact, even before we started, simply implementing a structured report in our system and stating the expectations for reporting, for example, that ventricular volumes, ideally, when they're performed by the sonographers, should be reported. Well, these are two of our hospitals within the system, and you see that 5 years ago, when we simply implemented a structured reporting process in the regional hospitals, the increase in reporting of biplane volumes significantly rose during and shortly following the implementation of that structured report. So as before, when mostly visual estimation of EF was performed and or a 4-chamber volume was reported relative to ejection fraction, again, encouraging physicians to report the biplane volumes resulted in a significant increase in the reporting of those biplane volumes. Then we need to operationalize the process. We need to determine how to select exams, which exams were to be reviewed. Of course, this is going to be it needs to be a randomized process. It needs to be a blinded process. We needed to select who the reviewers would be involving in this evaluation. The process for review, incorporating this into our workflow as best as possible, providing reports and feedback, and making sure there was continual process improvement. And again, here's the capability that we've implemented. We've written this into our system. We enabled the ability to create a peer-based quality control process using a multi-department and enterprise functionality. So we actually create exams. There are pointers and separate syngodynamics, and that's the process, the system we utilize within this syngodynamic department to point to the original exams. The sonographer reviews the exam, so there's a sonographer and a physician review, and it's determined whether that report met expectations or needed improvement. Physicians as well are reviewed. We examine the findings and we determine whether there's an issue with the report relative to minor or major. If there's no or minor issue with a given report, the QRA results were immediately sent, emailed to the sonographer and physician with regard to that outcome. And then there's an adjudication process for any of the major concerns that are identified. So here's a work list that's generated. This is a separate department on our server where exams are identified and attributed to a physician. This is the worksheet that is set up and on a review station with two separate monitors side by side. We're able to review the exam that is generated, a copy of the original exam that is generated, side by side with the patient's chart and as well as the report. We select that report. We're able to then compare, again, exam to our original review, and then generate a report for the physician and for the sonographer as well. So there's a physician review as well as a sonographer review. We do, again, enable, and this does enable for us, routine feedback to be provided to both the sonographer and the physician. We can assess the frequency of issues that arise. We can identify types of common issues, and we can guide topics for our monthly meetings. So our process is a routine random exam of approximately 3% of all studies read in the laboratory. These are reviewed at regular intervals. We review feedback provided by email notification for no issues or minor issues, and major discrepancies are sent for adjudication to a second reviewer. The lab director then reviews with a personal communication to the reader regarding findings, as well as an addend modification of the report suggestion. Remediation is recommended for major discrepancies, and a peer review committee implements a performance improvement or privileges review if necessary. And the Echo Peer Review Committee then reports to the Hospital Peer Review Committee as necessary. This has never been necessary, thankfully, to date. So these are the results of the Cleveland Clinic since 2013. Most notably is the fact that over time, and this is a very resource-intense endeavor, as you can imagine, we've actually decreased the number of reviews that have been conducted, and this is directly correlated to, again, a decrease in staffing and an increase in volume. So in summary, implementing a peer review process in your laboratory requires quite a bit of planning and preparation. I do think that a cardiovascular PACS system with structured reporting is a critical component. Transparency and impartiality is critical. We do need to incorporate this into the workflow if we're going to do this well and expect it to be done consistency and properly. It is a resource strain. However, I do believe it's well worth the effort and definitely important for our patients. Thank you very much.
So we've got time for questions now. We've got many questions that have come in to Dr. Weiner, and I'm going to let him guide you through them.
I'd like to thank our panel, and I'd like to thank our audience for their engagement. We have several questions which appear frequently, and people go right to the hardball ones, so I'm going to ask this of the entire panel and perhaps just go up or down the row. How do you handle labs which have a large and diverse medical staff, which have varying levels of interest and commitment to echo? Specifically, what corrective measures are effective for deficiencies in reporting, or, as one person said, physicians who sign off on sonographer reports without adequate review?
Richard, you want to start?
The question is, how do you handle this in a lab environment where it's not a single unified group, where you may have physicians with varying levels of interest and responsiveness to QI?
So none of this is simple or straightforward, of course. In fact, it was probably one of the most difficult processes that I've ever been involved in, and it has literally taken several years to implement. I must say that initially, and Bill's sitting in the front row right here, Bill Stewart, he's been involved with this with us as well. You know, it's nobody likes to do any of this. Nobody wants to do any of this. But I was remarkably impressed that after we implemented this, many readers and physicians, regardless of their levels and capabilities, actually thanked us for implementing it. When we provided them with feedback on a report, they were greatly appreciative. I think it's actually gone incredibly well. I've not yet had any adverse feedback or anybody coming to me with dramatically horrendous complaints or concerns. So, like I said, I think the items relative to transparency and impartiality, making it a fair process, making everybody know and understand how it works, enable them and get them part of the process is all part of the potential need and process. Yeah.
So I think, Rick has set the standard in terms of how this is done at Cleveland Clinic, and hats off. And culture's clearly important, but culture's not going to be enough. So, one of the things that Rick put in his slides that I wrote down is, you have to use your medical executive committee. You have to charter this. This isn't extra work. This is the work. And we can't tolerate things in the non-invasive labs that we wouldn't tolerate in the invasive labs. And that's one of the things that I think holds us back in terms of imaging. It's sort of extra. You can just read these at the end of the day. You can read them in 5 minutes. No way. So for those of us who are here, who believe in this, who want this to be what it needs to be, this is actually part of the work. And you can, try and should push culture and community and all of that, but you need some power tools. And that's why you have medical staff, credentialing committees, and I would really recommend that become part of the solution.
I agree. I think, though, if we can make it easy for people, that makes it better, too. And so I think the real-time feedback I find people like much better than sort of getting a stack of reports that you read last month and finding out that you had minor or major discrepancies on them. But so I think make it easy. I think the benevolent dictator is the best way. I mean, this is not a sort of committee thing. Someone at some point has to decide, and there has to be hard rules, as you said, but we need to do it.
In the community hospitals, we have some unique challenges, unlike some of the tertiary care centers and university hospitals where you have an echo lab where that's what these physicians do for their career. In the community, you might have people who have interest in interventional cardiology who still want to read a little bit. You might have people who read nuclear primarily but are also reading echo. And it can sometimes be delicate when you have to bring up reports that, there's disagreements on ejection fraction or severity of valvular lesions. But and it can be delicate at times, but in the end, I really believe that if you go back to guidelines and make it an educational opportunity, it works out very, very well. I mean, every physician wants to do a good job. They wake up in the morning wanting to do a good job. That they're just geared to do that. And so while in the community you have different levels of interest in echo, at the end of the day, going through the peer review process, doing quality improvement initiatives, they're very receptive. These multiple physicians are very receptive. Very rarely do I have an issue.
The other thing I forgot to mention, the tools that we're using in real time, you can set them that you literally cannot sign the report until this is fixed. And there's nothing like that to make people sort of learn quickly because they want to get the reports read and they're about to finalize the report. You can make suggestions or you can make it you cannot finalize this. And educationally, absolutely, if you want to put in, they may not know why is this flagging. There's a great area you can write a whole paragraph that says this is a requirement. You can even put the PDF in for the document if people want to know why are you making me do this. Right? It's not just our rules. These are guidelines. So you make it educational as you go, absolutely, and hopefully, like the rat getting the shock when it presses the button, eventually people will stop doing the same mistakes.
And I think industry and development is also key. We need to, voice our concerns with regard to these reports. I mean, again, as Kurt showed very nicely, where we could potentially be with regard, excuse me, I apologize, with these structured reports and enabling them to help us out, stacked views and pointing out images that are distinguishing a difference from one exam to the other in a easily managed and coordinated manner is a critical component, and we need to push industry to make these changes and to develop these reporting capabilities.
Thank you very much. And we have another pair of questions regarding application of the appropriate use criteria. We have overutilization on the inpatient side. How do you convince other services, particularly non-cardiologists, that not everyone needs a full echo with every clinical change, especially STAT? And on the outpatient side, how can you gently educate ordering providers that a request for an echo may not be appropriate?
So I'll take that one on. I think, the second one is a harder issue, right? Because there's, such an array of providers out there who are funneling in. And, it begins by tracking inside the lab where you suspect that these may be inappropriate echoes. Again, oftentimes we don't have all the information in the echo lab about what's going on with the patient, but a lot of times we do. So, for example, the patient has just had an echo within the last, 3 months or 6 months. So there can be reminders and systems that are put in place. And in fact, Mike Main's group has done an elegant study on it, precisely this, about, trying to remind people that, hey, look, a study was done recently, maybe you don't need one. So I think as with the theme that comes into play here is leveraging the electronic tools that we have. The first issue is just the frequency function, right? Flag something that a study was done within a certain period of time and then have a process that can get that information back. That's a little bit easier, if you will, in the inpatient setting because, again, you've got an array of hospitalists and other providers and so forth who are, following the protocol, the heart failure protocol or this protocol and the checkbox. They may not have even knowingly ordered the study. It just came through. There's got to be a connection between what's happening in the lab and what's in your archive base and what's in the platform. So I think it's not an easy answer, but I think it needs to be pursued from communication and electronic tools.
Should we wrap it up? And, I think maybe we're right at 9:30, and I think we'll have to congratulate ourselves on a great session, increasing interest among everyone. Thank you.